We're a nonprofit organization dedicated to eradicating human slavery, human trafficking, child exploitation, and child sexual abuse material through disrupting networks and applying data technology and advanced analytics and intelligence.
Good morning. My name is Dr. Sharon Kaler, and I'm the Director of Mental Health and Survivor Relations here at ATII. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing Ms. Timea Nagy, our keynote speaker for the 3rd annual Follow Money, Fight Slavery Summit. Ms. Nagy is a human trafficking survivor originally from Budapest, Hungary, and an incredible woman who overcame a horrible situation. Ms. Nagy was lured to Canada in 1998 by an ad that promised to help her raise money for her family that was very much in need. However, once she arrived, she discovered the truth of the situation and her nightmare began. Ms. Nagy was held hostage in Toronto and trafficked by an international trafficking ring for 3 terrifying months. Despite her situation, she didn't give up and thankfully was able to escape, ultimately turning her hardship into advocacy for other victims of human trafficking. Ms. Nagy founded Walk With Me, a nonprofit organization to assist victims of human trafficking and law enforcement agencies. Between 2009 and 2015, Walk With Me helped over 300 victims and assisted in over 500 human trafficking-related investigations throughout Canada. In fact, Ms. Nagy played a key role in Canada's largest human trafficking investigation, led by the Canadian Federal Police. She's provided training to numerous agencies in Canada, the US, and Europe, reaching over 10,000 law enforcement officers, and is the first human trafficking survivor to train banks and financial institutions on human trafficking detection through transactions. Furthermore, Ms. Nagy played an important role in the Canadian National Financial Human Trafficking Task Force, Project Protect. Ms. Nagy's contributions to the fight against human trafficking have been widely recognized. Her journey was chronicled at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights in 2014, and she's received numerous awards, including the Prime Minister's Volunteer Award, the Queen Elizabeth Diamond Jubilee Medal, and the International Freedom Award by Free the Slaves. Just this past summer, she was awarded Canada's highest honor for her efforts, a Meritorious Service Medal by the Governor General himself. It's my pleasure to introduce this brave and inspiring woman and survivor, Ms. Timea Nagy.
Ones who've been doing this for a long time and the ones that are just starting to learn about human trafficking, welcome. Thank you very much for signing up for this incredible 3-day event and wanting to better yourself and learn way more about the topic so that you can be a better investigator and fight this horrible crime with the best tools that you can possibly use. I do believe that you have heard some incredible presenters yesterday. I know the agenda for today. I'm very excited for all the new content and updated intelligence that you are going to walk away from. Again, so that you can be a better investigator and help to fight this crime and pull out victims potentially while they are being victimized, just simply by hitting the send button and send it up to, FinTrack or FinCEN about suspicious activities.
Good morning.
I would like to give you a little bit of a different perspective this morning as a keynote speaker. I want to give you the survival-led perspective on AML and the importance of including survivors and survivors' perspectives and people with lived experience into your work, into your investigations, into your building this platform, into building AI related technology, because we do have that unique perspective. Just simply because we lived it, we lived the world. There are players. There is a whole thing about this human trafficking world that is not really presented or talked about at conferences, rightfully so, because it's a perspective that you unfortunately only know when you are in it. So one of the things that we talk a lot about is that victims of human trafficking, while they are being victimized, they don't understand that they are victims of human trafficking. They just feel like that they are in this deep hole and they can't get out. And with various techniques, the traffickers are trying to brainwash us and make us believe that this is exactly where we want to be and there's nowhere to go. We call it the invisible chains because it takes about 2 to 3 weeks for a trafficker to kind of brainwash us and emotionally damage us to a point where we say, you're right, I have nowhere to go. There's nothing else I can do. I can't go to the police. I'm afraid. And I'm just going to stay here with you and I'm going to be victimized and make so much money for you and give it away. And that's where you come in, where police agencies are trying to get the victims to come forward and testify. And I have trained police and I worked on numerous operations to trying to get the victims to come forward. At the end of the day, we end up going to these trials in court, and day after day, day in and day out, we end up losing these court cases still because it becomes a victim-centered crime. It's a he said, she said. It's all up to what she says. It's all up to proving that she's a perfect citizen. She was a perfect human being before, and building up her credibility. So it's usually the victims that are on trial in court cases. So the moment of awareness came to me when I was invited 7 years ago to a AI company in Canada who provides an anti-money laundering software to banks and larger banks now. And they basically were working on a human trafficking part of that software. And during the presentation, the engineer pulled up a few transaction documents that they got out of one of the human trafficking alert from one of the bank in San Francisco. And they asked me if I can look at the transaction alerts. And I looked at it and I said, yeah, this is 100% human trafficking. And they said, why? I said, well, look at the transactions, look at the timing, look at everything. It was, and that's when I realized that if we would had these documents in court for the last few years, these documents, the transactions, clearly showing a lifestyle that is clearly aligned with human trafficking. So I realized then that you guys, people in the financial sector, and people who are investigating human trafficking in the cyberspace through potentially the financial footprint, are my new best friends, and I think you guys are the new undercover superheroes of society. So let me just give you some thoughts in a short period of time from the survivor's perspective. I truly believe that human trafficking is a behavior crime. So you can't really tell one way or another just by one flag or the other if this is human trafficking or not. No single red flag is a clear indication to human trafficking or smuggling. Another thing I always say is, if you just think about what human trafficking is all about, it's just about greed. Human traffickers have one thing in common. They're all greedy and they want money. Money that goes through the financial system, money that can actually be followed. And victims, unfortunately, have one thing in common. They are all desperate for something. Each victim has a desperation or are in a desperate or vulnerable situation for different reasons. They lost their parents, they lost their brother, they lost their boyfriend, it's a war, they lost their house, there's financial, their mom is sick. I mean, there's various reasons, and unfortunately, they end up meeting with the trafficker who knows that this individual is very vulnerable. So in my presentations, I always, most of the time, focus on sex trafficking because that's what I lived, that's what I understand, and that's the field that I worked in. But there's different types of sex trafficking, and each sex trafficking, there's different types of trafficking, and each trafficking will have different type of financial transaction footprint. In this presentation, or keynote speaking, I'm really going to focus on the domestic sex trafficking. So one of the things, I'm going to break this down to you like it was never broken down before. Just remind you, I usually do this in 2-3 hours. So I'm going to do my very best to give you some highlights to think about. So one of the things that's actually very important to understand when you're looking at a potential sex trafficking ring is the type of traffickers. Each version of traffickers will act differently, have a different lifestyle, a different goal, a different mindset, and they conduct business differently. They're going to make different type of money, a different amount of money. They move differently. Everything is different about them. So you have to understand that, because when you start looking at the transactions, you want to know what type of a traffickers you're dealing with, because then you understand, then all the transactions and the story that the transactions are telling you will make a lot more sense. So here's the type of traffickers. Please take a picture, keep it by your desk. There's the businessman type of traffickers can actually offer a percentage to their victims. So that means that if you see a connection between a businessman type of a trafficker and a victim, there's a chance that the victim actually is going to be able to make a little bit more money. Doesn't mean she's not victimized, doesn't mean that she's not forced to be there, and so on and so forth, but the percentage that he's allowing to make for her to make, it's a little bit different. So for example, 60-40 or 90-10 or 80% to 20%, which versus the old-fashioned traffickers, they never ever allow survivors or victims to keep their money. There's the female friend. So female friends can be traffickers and recruiters at the same time, and they will travel with your victims. So you may actually see them going together, and you might actually mistake that individual to be just a friend. But again, just look at the transactions. We'll talk about it in a minute. There's the Romeo pimp, which is where the lover boy comes in. Obviously, it looks like they have a relationship, but again, there are several indicators that I'll talk about later on that will differentiate for you between, like, help you understand if it's actually a relationship or not. There's the gorilla pimp. The gorilla pimp is the type who is very physically abusive, and there was no romance, there's no friendship, there's no business built, nothing. These individuals are most often being taken, and within 24 hours they're being trafficked and forced to work. They're being beaten. There's a lot of physical and emotional and psychological violence. And gorilla pimps like to make a lot of money really, really fast on their victims, really, really soon. And then you see them switching out the victims very quickly. I mean, even in less than 3 months. And then there's a friend of a friend and a family. So family can be tricky because you think it's a family member, and then you see the transactions, but turns out that they're actually traffickers. So the profile of the victims, I think you're very familiar with that by now. Anywhere between 11 to 25 years old. They could actually be up to 45 students from small towns, big cities, and obviously they are emotionally and financially extremely vulnerable. The crime of human trafficking, the crime of sex trafficking need certain actors and facilitators. So you need the traffickers and their associates, you need the victim, buyer, and facilitators, and you're going to see all those actors in a transaction. Here's a very important slide, key players of sex trafficking. There are some actors, there are some individuals in a sex trafficking that you might not even be aware of who they are, why they got so money. It doesn't make any sense for you when you're looking at charts or when you investigate. So one of them is the exploited individual, the victim. That's pretty obvious, trafficker. But then traffickers often work with the driver and handler. the person who would drive the victims around. So the trafficker could be in New York, and the victim and the driver and the handler could be in Los Angeles, and that's why you see money going back and forth. There's also the individuals who are recruiting. So a recruiter can work out of Vegas, New York, whatever, the nightclubs, keep recruiting and getting money from the trafficker. Recruiter actually also could be the driver and the handler. It can actually get complicated, but as long as you understand who's who in a zoo, then it makes so much more sense for you to look at organizational charts and money flowing around. There's always, almost always in every group, there is a bottom girl, which is probably the trafficker's first victim who got basically in a higher position now with the trafficker, and now she's kind of the boss. And there's also sometimes they hire what's called the intimidators. It's just guys completely outside of their group or women, and they also get one-time fees here and there. So the key tools for sex trafficking, I am almost certain you're already full aware of these. But one of the things that is really, really the one platform where everything meets is online transactions. Money has to be sent, money has to be paid for rental cars, hotels, food, taxi, Uber. There's always, almost always, a trail in the financials indicating sex trafficking. So I'll give you a very quick drop down on sex trafficking. So in sex trafficking, you have the trafficker, the driver, the handler, you have the buyer, and you have the victim. But this could look very different in different scenarios. So here are the new up and coming versions of sex trafficking groups and organized crimes. So there is your old fashioned trafficker-victim relationship. That's usually a Romeo pimp. It could be a business pimp too, but most of the time it's a Romeo pimp. So it's like one victim, one trafficker. So the money is made by the victim, sent to a trafficker, no other individuals. Now, the very new trend is that two traffickers are traveling with two victims, and sometimes they put the hotels on the other's name, then the girl pays, then the guy pays, and it just gets mixed up, and you just don't understand why you see this, but you see them kind of together, but not together. That's a new trend. Like I said, two guys traveling with two girls, which means the two guys can look out for each other, and then the two girls can look out for each other, and the two guys can look after the victims. And so there's no escaping. And then what's the most traditional and most popular version of an organizational chart and a group that you might see, and I mean, it might vary, but you have your trafficker. Trafficker has a group of drivers, handlers, intimidators, recruiters, whatever that is. Trafficker has a real life persona, a businessman, owns a car dealership, a fitness store, a promoting company, works as a social worker. I mean, I've seen it all. And they have a family. They have a wife, they have kids and everything. So most of the thing would go on the wife's name, but the transaction would be in between the driver, the victims, victims back to driver, victims back to handler. Now, this is the best part of the presentation, I think. I think there's a lot of misconception about sex trafficking and sex work and how does it work and how much money do they make. So I'm going to break it down for you. This is a pretty fresh data post-COVID. The money in the sex industry changes a lot. And you really have to understand the sex industry as a business. Just like any other business, if you are looking at a bad actor that's potentially a restaurant, you have to understand how much the restaurant makes, potentially how much this restaurant should be making. So if this restaurant makes technically $100,000, why do they have $500,000 revenues, and why are they not paying employees? I mean, there's a little so the same thing with the sex industry. The sex industry is very structured. You need money, you need investment, and you need to know where, how to post, the words you use. It's very structured. So I'm going to break it down to you so that the numbers that you see in organizational charts or transactions can actually make sense to you. Is it make sense to see $60,000 coming to one individual and leaving? Is it make sense for $40,000? How much money do you even make in a sex industry if you're a sex traffic victim? So I'll break it down to you. Feel free to take a picture. $8,400 a week approximately is how much a sex trafficked victim makes. I will break it down after that. But it's about 30 to 65 cities a year. Now that, if we are looking at the sex trafficking crew who's traveling, it's called the circuit sex trafficking. So that's the most popular version of sex trafficking. So if they travel, it's about 30 to 65 cities. You make about $8,400 a week. It's about 5 cities per month and 1.5 cities per week. So you can actually pull that data very easily. But here's the full breakdown. A monthly trafficking expense report per victim. So if you're looking at these, transactions all together and you're looking at the balance, what's coming in, what's going out, what are they spending on, these are very similar, like these are the clear indicators of a potential sex trafficking ring. This is per victim. So if the individual has 1 or 2 or 3 or more victims, you got to double the amount. So escort ads, it's $840. A hotel, now this is a monthly expense. Hotels cost about $1,400. Condoms cost about $168. So that's where you would see Shopper Drug Mart or Walmart or 7-Eleven expenses. Transportation, so it could be Uber, could be rental, could be whatever. It's about $1,000. Food for the victims is $600 a month. And if you break that down, it comes to about $20 to $30 a day. They don't allow victims to eat a lot on purpose. Then you pay definitely somebody like a handler, that's about $2,000. So your total expenses come to about $6,000 a month. So if you post 6 ads per day, your revenues are about $33,000 a month. So $33,600 is how much they make approximately, minus your expenses, which is about $6,000. So the trafficker or the victim technically makes $27,000, $25,000 a month. That's month. So where does that money goes? So that's how you know, is this a sex worker who works independently or is it a sex trafficked victim? Sex worker can make the same amount of money, though they probably won't because they don't need to work 6-7 times. They don't need to see 6-10 clients a day. So they probably make a little less. So I always say follow the money. So here's your trafficker. The trafficker sends some money to the handler or the victim so they can book the hotels. The victim is the one who's making the money over and over again. So the victim either send the money back to the handler or the trafficker. But either way, the money will always come from the victim and somehow always will find its way back to the trafficker. And I always say this balance key is always, the account balance is always the key. If the money comes into the victim, say I make $1,500 or $2,000 a day, and I take out all the cash because I give it to my trafficker, but I leave in $200, I leave that in potentially for tomorrow's hotel. So like, look at how much comes in, how much goes out. This is exactly why I said that balance key, human trafficking is a behavior crime. You have to look at the whole picture, especially in sex trafficking. So I got the most comments for this slide. Feel free to take a picture. The other thing that you can do is to take a look at, it's not always what you see on the account. It's what you don't see. And why do I say this? Victims of human trafficking don't have a life. Most often don't even have a place to live. They live in the hotels, they live in the motels, they live in the cars, they live in the highway and the fast food. They don't have a life. That means if there's an individual who's potentially a victim, the transactions of hotel, motel, rental, constant traveling, no rent payment, no mortgage, no transactions that indicate any sort of a normal life, such as groceries, mortgage, rent, housewares, furniture, decor, candle, purchases related to hobbies, hair appointments, dentist appointments, taking your animal to the vet. You're not going to see any of that, again, because we do not have a normal life. So just kind of last kind of thoughts is there's different type of trafficking. I said this, there's sex trafficking, there's forced labor. Forced labor is just as unfortunately popular as sex trafficking, but it's so much harder to detect. So in a forced labor, how do you know if there's human trafficking happening? So in forced labor, if you're a bank and you're dealing with business accounts, or if you're investigating a larger account, the way to know this is human trafficking happens for greed. If I own a company, the best way to cut fat in my expenses is not to pay my employees. So if you're ever looking at a company or a big corporation or business, do they pay the employees or not? Now, that might also sometimes be tricky, because in some cases we have seen it, they pay the employees and then they take them to the bank in one minivan, and then as they walk out of the bank, they ask them to cash their checks in the bank. They walk out with the cash and they hand back the money to the trafficker. So that also could be tricky, but that might require some scene visits. In sex trafficking, you have multiple victims most often, and almost at all times the profits are transferred back to the traffickers. So forced labor, you have a lot of victims, you probably have a temp agency, money probably goes to the temp agency and back to the trafficker. With sex trafficking, it's almost all the time the money will go from the victim to the trafficker, or the handler and the trafficker. So the one thing I wanted to tell you is, before I close my thoughts, is that human trafficking now is this buzzword, if I can say. There's a lot of people from different sectors are coming in to try to help, and everybody is helping, and I think the movement is in incredible shape. But I do believe that the movement got this huge kick, and we are actually starting to win this game, since people from the financial sector and cyber investigators and AML investigators came on board. Because when the money that human traffickers make from victims like me goes through financial institutions and it gets reported, eventually traffickers will have nowhere to go. If you can't get a hotel because you are flagged, if you can't get an Uber to get your victim to A to B because you're flagged, if your credit card isn't working, if you can't pay for a rental car, if those elements that facilitating sex trafficking will shut you down and shut you out, you cannot no longer do this work as a human trafficker. You're gonna have to close the shop and find other crimes to commit, because you cannot for much longer do this in a cashless society. So please keep up the fantastic work, and every single one of you is greatly appreciated, and the hard work that you are doing. And I am always available for any follow-up questions. You can find me on LinkedIn as well. So yeah, just keep up the education, keep up the awareness, and keep up the great work. And thank you so much, and have a fantastic rest of your summit.